trapped in my own home, targeted by someone who should protect us. I wasn't even in the HOA, but he came after me, relentlessly. The truth behind his obsession will shock you, and it's more twisted than you think. Watch till the end to uncover the secrets he tried to bury. Subscribe now for more heart-stopping stories of courage and survival. I moved into my new house with high hopes, excited about the fresh start and peaceful neighborhood. The house was perfect. Cozy rooms, a small garden, and friendly neighbors who waved as they passed by. Little did I know, my dream home was about to turn into a nightmare. It all started one sunny afternoon when I noticed a man in a uniform standing on my porch, clipboard in hand and a stern expression on his face. Confused, I opened the door, and before I could greet him, he barked, "You're violating HOA regulations. You're being fined." I stared at him, stunned. HOA? But I wasn't part of any Homeowners Association. In fact, one of the selling points of this house was the freedom from those strict rules. I tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. "Ignorance isn't an excuse," he snapped, thrusting a paper toward me. It listed fines for petty things: having my trash can visible, my grass being too long, and even the color of my front door. I felt anger rising, but tried to stay calm. "I'm not in the HOA," I repeated, showing him my purchase papers. He glanced at them, unfazed, and shrugged. "Everyone in this neighborhood is under the HOA's jurisdiction. You can either pay the fines or face consequences." His tone was cold, final, as if there was no room for argument. I watched in disbelief as he turned and walked away, leaving me with a crumpled paper and a sinking feeling in my stomach. Days passed, and I thought it was just a misunderstanding that would resolve itself. But the fines kept coming, each one more absurd than the last. They even charged me for having unauthorized plants in my garden. I tried reaching out to the HOA, but no one returned my calls. Frustration gave way to anger. I was being targeted, harassed for rules I never agreed to follow. Determined to clear things up, I decided to confront the so-called HOA Cop face to face. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a battle that would challenge everything I believed about fairness and justice. I started asking around the neighborhood, hoping to find some answers. Most people avoided the topic, their faces turning pale at the mere mention of the HOA. But one neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman who had lived there for decades, finally opened up. She lowered her voice as she spoke, glancing around nervously, as if someone might be listening. "That man, they call him the HOA Cop. He's not just some employee. He's the enforcer. Whatever he says goes, and no one dares to question him." Her words sent a chill down my spine. How could one man have so much power? And why was he targeting me when I wasn't even part of their association? Determined to get to the bottom of this, I decided to confront him directly. I found him patrolling the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, his eyes scanning for any minor infraction. I marched up to him, my heart pounding, but my resolve firm. "We need to talk. I'm not in your HOA, and yet you keep sending me these fines. This has to stop." He looked at me with a smug grin, his eyes cold and calculating. "You moved into this neighborhood, so you follow the rules. It's that simple." I couldn't believe his arrogance. "But my house isn't under HOA jurisdiction. I checked before buying." His smile widened, almost enjoying my frustration. "Things change. The HOA expanded, and now your property falls under our control. You should have read the fine print." His words hung in the air, heavy and menacing. I felt my anger boiling over. This is harassment. You can't just make up rules and force them on people. His expression hardened, his voice dropping to a low, threatening tone. You don't get it, do you? I'm the law around here. Either you comply, or you'll regret it. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, fists clenched in rage. It was clear now. This wasn't just about fines. It was about power and control. And if I didn't fight back, he'd keep coming after me. But what could I do against someone who seemed to own the entire neighborhood? I knew I couldn't take this lying down. If he was determined to bully me into submission, then I needed to arm myself with knowledge. I spent hours digging through property documents, reviewing my purchase agreement, and researching HOA laws. As I suspected, my property was explicitly listed as exempt from any HOA regulations. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to escalate the matter. I contacted a lawyer, hoping to get some legal backup. The attorney listened patiently, his face growing more serious as I explained the situation. This isn't just about fines. It sounds like they're trying to assert control illegally. We can fight this. His words were a relief, but I knew the battle was far from over. Meanwhile, the harassment intensified. The HOA cop wasn't backing down. One morning, I woke up to find a notice taped to my door, an eviction warning for failure to comply with HOA rules. It was absurd. How could they evict me from my own house when I wasn't even a member? My blood boiled as I crumpled the paper in my fist. This was getting out of hand. Determined not to be intimidated, I confronted him again, this time with my lawyer by my side. As we approached him, his confident smirk faltered for a moment before returning, more smug than ever. You brought backup? Cute, but it won't help you. I have the authority here. My lawyer stepped in, his voice firm and unyielding. Actually, you don't. We have legal documents proving that my client's property is exempt from HOA regulations. Continuing to harass him will result in legal action. The HOA cop's face darkened, his jaw tightening. But instead of backing down, he laughed, a cold, chilling sound. You think some papers are going to stop me? I run this neighborhood. I can make your life miserable. The threat hung heavy in the air, a promise of more trouble to come. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was he really that powerful? But as I looked at my lawyer, his steady gaze reassured me. This man was nothing more than a bully with a badge, and I was ready to stand my ground. After that confrontation, I expected things to cool down, but the HOA cop doubled down on his intimidation tactics. Suddenly, I was bombarded with complaints. Anonymous letters accused me of noise violations, improper parking, and even claimed my house was an eyesore. It was ridiculous, and I knew exactly who was behind it. But things took a darker turn when I found a bright orange sticker slapped on my front window, condemned, uninhabitable property. My heart sank as I read the notice. Was this even legal? Furious and confused, I ripped it off and stormed into the HOA office, determined to get answers. The receptionist looked uncomfortable when I demanded to speak with the head of the HOA. She hesitated before whispering, "You don't want to mess with him. He controls everything around here." Her words confirmed my worst fears. This man really was untouchable, but I refused to back down. Eventually, I was led into a lavish office where he sat behind a massive desk, his smug grin already plastered on his face. Back again? I told you. Resistance is pointless. He leaned back, his posture exuding confidence. Your property is a nuisance. Either comply or prepare to face the consequences. I could feel my blood boiling. You can't just condemn my house. It's perfectly safe, and I have every right to live there. He shrugged, his eyes cold. I make the rules. If you don't like it, then leave. His arrogance was infuriating. I'm not going anywhere. You have no legal grounds, and I won't be bullied by you. His expression darkened, the smugness fading. Then you're in for a fight, he hissed, his voice low and threatening. I'll make sure you regret ever moving here. With that, he stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. I left his office, my hands shaking with anger and fear. It was clear now. This wasn't just about fines or rules. It was personal. He wanted to break me, to make an example out of me. But I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. If he wanted a fight, then a fight he would get. The next few days were a nightmare. The harassment escalated to a whole new level. I started receiving calls from unknown numbers at all hours, with voices whispering threats before hanging up. Trash was dumped on my lawn, and my mailbox was vandalized repeatedly. It was clear that the HOA Cop was behind it, but proving it was another matter. I felt trapped, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next attack. But I refused to be driven out of my own home. If he thought fear would make me leave, he was wrong. I decided to fight back the only way I knew how, by exposing him. I installed security cameras around my property, hoping to catch him or his minions in the act. At first, nothing happened. Days passed with no incidents, almost as if he knew I was watching. But just as I began to let my guard down, the cameras finally captured something. In the dead of night, a shadowy figure crept onto my property, spray painting offensive graffiti on my garage door. I watched the footage in disbelief as the person turned toward the camera for a split second, revealing the unmistakable face of the HOA Cop. It was him, caught red-handed, acting like some petty thug. My shock quickly turned to anger. How could someone in his position stoop so low? It was time to bring him down. Armed with the footage, I went to the police, confident that justice would be served. But my hope was short-lived. The officer behind the desk sighed when I showed him the evidence. Yeah, we know him. He's got connections in high places. Even the precinct chief lives in that neighborhood. My heart sank. That's how he'd gotten away with his abuse of power for so long. He was protected by the very people who were supposed to uphold the law. But I couldn't give up now. If the local authorities wouldn't help, I'd take my story to the public. It was time to show everyone the kind of man he truly was, and I knew just how to do it. Determined to expose him, I turned to social media. I uploaded the security footage, along with a detailed account of everything that had happened, from the false fines to the harassment and vandalism. I shared how he was targeting me, despite not being in the HOA, abusing his power simply because he could. The post went viral within hours, attracting hundreds of comments from people who were outraged by his behavior. Some even shared their own stories of being bullied by corrupt HOA officials. It was clear that I wasn't alone, and the public was on my side. News outlets picked up the story, eager to cover the scandal brewing in what was supposed to be a quiet suburban neighborhood. Reporters showed up at my door, wanting interviews. I spoke openly, refusing to be silenced. Meanwhile, the HOA Cop was nowhere to be seen. He avoided the cameras, but the damage to his reputation was done. With the pressure mounting, the local HOA board held an emergency meeting to address the controversy. I attended, armed with my lawyer and all the evidence I'd gathered. As I walked into the room, every eye was on me, the atmosphere tense. He was there too, sitting at the head of the table, his face pale and lips pressed into a thin line. Gone was the smug arrogance he once wore so confidently. Now, he looked cornered, like an animal trapped with no escape. The board members were furious, not just because of his actions, but because his scandal was now their problem too. One by one, they demanded answers. He tried to deny everything, his voice shaking as he stumbled through excuses. But the evidence was undeniable. Videos, documents, even witness testimonies from neighbors who finally found the courage to speak out. It was over. He was finished, and I could see it in his eyes. The board meeting erupted into chaos. Members shouted over each other, demanding his resignation. His influence, once absolute, crumbled under the weight of the evidence. He tried one last desperate move, claiming the footage was doctored, that I was orchestrating a smear campaign. But no one believed him. The facts were too clear, his actions too blatant. I watched as his confidence shattered, his shoulders slumping under the pressure. The mighty HOA Cop was finally powerless. The board chairwoman stood up, her voice cold and resolute. "You've overstepped your authority for the last time. You're removed from your position, effective immediately." His face went pale, eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't do this. I built this HOA. I made this neighborhood what it is." His voice cracked, desperation replacing his usual arrogance. But the board was unmoved. They had to save their own reputations now, and he was the perfect scapegoat. Security escorted him out, his protests echoing down the hallway. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered everything he'd put me through, all the sleepless nights and fear he'd caused. This was justice, and he was finally facing the consequences of his actions. After the meeting, the board approached me, attempting damage control. They apologized profusely, insisting they had no idea about his illegal activities. It was hard to believe, but I had bigger priorities. "I want all the fines dropped and a formal acknowledgement that my property is not under HOA jurisdiction," I demanded. They agreed without hesitation, desperate to end the scandal. My lawyer made sure everything was in writing, ironclad and legally binding. At last, I was free from his tyranny. But even as I walked out victorious, I knew this wasn't just about me. He had hurt countless others. I was determined to make sure he'd never have the power to do it again. With his power stripped away, I expected the harassment to end, but the fallout was far from over. News of his removal spread like wildfire, and neighbors who had lived in fear for years began speaking out. They shared stories of being threatened, fined for imaginary violations, and even bullied into selling their homes. The more people talked, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about one man abusing his authority. It was about a corrupt system that had allowed him to operate unchecked. Determined to see justice served, I encouraged the victims to come forward, to file complaints and demand accountability. It didn't take long for the legal repercussions to follow. Class action lawsuits were filed, not only against him, but against the HOA itself for negligence and complicity. Investigators dug deep, uncovering a web of corruption that went beyond petty fines. He had been pocketing money from fake citations, using his position to line his pockets while terrorizing the community. The scandal rocked the neighborhood, making headlines as one of the worst abuses of HOA power in recent history. But the man at the center of it all was nowhere to be found. He had vanished, refusing to answer calls or appear in court. Rumors swirled. Some said he had fled the state. Others claimed he was hiding to avoid arrest. I felt a mix of relief and unease. He was gone, but his legacy of fear lingered. Even without his presence, the damage he'd done was deep, and the community struggled to heal. To help rebuild trust, I volunteered to assist in reforming the HOA. We implemented transparent rules, elected new leaders, and ensured that no one could ever wield that kind of power again. It was a long, difficult process, but with every meeting and every change made, the neighborhood began to feel like home again. Yet, even as life returned to normal, a nagging question remained. Where had he gone? And would he ever come back seeking revenge? Just when I thought things were finally settling down, strange incidents started happening. It began with small annoyances. Garbage cans knocked over. Strange noises at night. At first, I brushed it off as coincidence, but then I found my car keyed with deep scratches. The words, "You'll pay," etched into the paint. My heart raced as I looked around, half expecting to see him watching from the shadows. But no one was there. I reported it to the police, who took notes but offered little hope. Without witnesses or camera footage, there's not much we can do, the officer said, his tone sympathetic but resigned. I felt a chill run down my spine. Was he back? Determined not to be intimidated, I doubled down on security. I upgraded my cameras, installed motion-activated lights, and even started carrying pepper spray, just in case. But no matter how prepared I felt, the sense of unease wouldn't go away. Every creak in the house, every shadow outside the window, made my heart pound. I barely slept, constantly on edge. I began seeing his face everywhere, in passing cars, in crowds at the grocery store. Paranoia crept in, making me question my own sanity. Was he really stalking me? Or was my mind playing tricks after everything I'd been through? The answer came one night when my doorbell rang at 2 a.m. I jolted awake, heart racing. I checked the camera feed and froze. There he was, standing on my porch, his face twisted with fury. He looked nothing like the arrogant man I remembered. His clothes were disheveled, his hair wild, eyes sunken and bloodshot. He looked like a man who had lost everything. My hands trembled as I watched him pound on my door, shouting, "You ruined my life. This is all your fault." Fear gripped me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I called the police, my voice shaking as I explained the situation. As I watched him on the camera, pacing and yelling, I realized that this wasn't just about revenge. He had truly lost his mind, and he was blaming me for his downfall. The police arrived swiftly, lights flashing as they pulled up to my house. I watched through the camera feed as they approached him, weapons drawn, demanding he get on the ground. For a moment, he stood defiant, his eyes wild with rage. But then his shoulders slumped, and he dropped to his knees, his anger dissolving into broken sobs. It was a surreal sight. This man who once ruled the neighborhood with fear, now reduced to a shattered figure, powerless and defeated. The officers cuffed him and led him away, his head hanging low. As they passed by my window, he glanced up, his eyes locking with mine. The hatred in his gaze was unmistakable, and a chill ran down my spine. Even in defeat, he blamed me. After giving my statement to the police, I sat in my living room, trying to process everything. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with fear. Would this nightmare ever truly end? He was in custody, but his words echoed in my mind. A promise of vengeance. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was my lawyer. They're charging him with harassment, vandalism, and trespassing. Given his past actions, he's facing serious jail time. I exhaled, the tension easing slightly. At least for now, he was out of my life. But the damage he had done would take a long time to heal. News of his arrest spread quickly, and the community finally felt safe enough to move on. The new HOA board implemented reforms, ensuring no one would ever hold that much power again. Neighbors began to trust each other, to rebuild the sense of community he had destroyed. As for me, I slowly reclaimed my peace, no longer jumping at every noise or shadow, but I knew I would never be the same. His actions had changed me, made me stronger, but also more guarded. Even as I watched him face justice, a part of me stayed vigilant, always watching, always ready, just in case he ever came back. With him behind bars, life gradually returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after everything that had happened. The neighborhood was finally free from his grip, and the atmosphere felt lighter. People smiled more, greeted each other without fear, and community events resumed, bringing back the warmth that he had stolen. Yet, even as things improved, a lingering unease stayed with me. I couldn't shake the memory of his twisted face, his eyes burning with hatred as they dragged him away. I kept reminding myself that he was locked up, unable to hurt anyone anymore. But I still double-checked my locks every night. One afternoon, I received a call from the district attorney handling the case. "We've secured a plea deal," she explained. "He's agreed to confess to all charges in exchange for a reduced sentence." Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. "He's taking the deal to avoid a public trial," she continued. "No apologies, no remorse, just a way to minimize his punishment." I hung up, anger boiling inside me. After everything he'd done, he still refused to take responsibility. It felt unfair, but I knew it was the best way to ensure he stayed behind bars. At least the community would be safe from him for a while. Despite his absence, traces of his reign remained. The damage he had done wasn't just physical. People were still rebuilding trust, hesitant to fully believe that his influence was gone. I became an advocate for change, working with the new HOA board to prevent another abuse of power. We revised rules, established checks and balances, and empowered homeowners to speak out without fear. It was exhausting but necessary work. With each meeting, I felt a sense of closure, a step closer to truly moving on. Yet, in the back of my mind, his last words haunted me, a reminder that some battles leave scars long after they're over. Months passed, and the community continued to heal, but I couldn't fully relax. I kept tabs on his case, needing to know exactly where he was and how long he'd be locked away. One day, my worst fear was realized. I received a call informing me that he had been released on parole for good behavior. My heart dropped. How could someone so vindictive be considered rehabilitated? Panic surged through me, memories of his threats flooding back. Was he coming for revenge? Was I safe? I increased my security again, reinforcing every measure I could think of. But no cameras or locks could calm the dread gnawing at me. The days that followed were tense. Every knock on the door made me jump. Every unfamiliar face sent my heart racing. I felt like a prisoner in my own home. I informed my neighbors, urging them to stay alert. But no one had seen him. It was as if he had vanished. Yet, the feeling of being watched never left me. One night, as I was locking up, I noticed something on my porch. It was a note, scrawled in jagged handwriting. "This isn't over." My blood ran cold. He was back, and he wanted me to know it. But how? He was supposed to be monitored, restricted from coming near me. Clearly, he didn't care about the law. I went to the police, but they offered little reassurance. "We'll keep an eye out." But without witnesses, there's not much we can do. It was the same line I'd heard before, and it did nothing to ease my fear. I realized that if I wanted to protect myself, I'd have to be proactive. I started documenting everything, every suspicious noise, every unfamiliar car parked nearby, every letter left on my property. I was determined to build a case strong enough to put him away for good this time, but the stress was wearing me down, and he knew it. This was his game, psychological warfare, and he was winning. The harassment continued, subtle yet relentless. Notes appeared sporadically, each one more threatening than the last. I found dead plants on my porch, their leaves scorched and crumpled, a cruel mockery of the garden fines he once imposed. My car tires were slashed twice, and the police were still powerless without any solid evidence linking him to the crimes. It felt like he was everywhere and nowhere, a shadow haunting my every move. I was exhausted, my nerves frayed, but I refused to let him win. If his goal was to break me, then he was about to be disappointed. I hired a private investigator, someone experienced in stalking and harassment cases. We reviewed the security footage, searching for any sign of him. Days turned into weeks, with no clear leads. It was infuriating. He was tormenting me without leaving a trace. But then, one evening, the investigator called with a breakthrough. "I've got something. He's smart, but not smart enough." He showed me footage from a camera I'd forgotten about, hidden under the eaves of my house. There he was, lurking in the shadows, watching my home for hours before slipping away. The image was grainy, but his face was unmistakable. We finally had proof. With the new evidence, my lawyer helped me file a restraining order, and this time, the police took action. They found him living in a rundown motel just outside of town, violating his parole by being within a certain distance of my house. He was arrested again, but the look he gave me as they took him away sent chills down my spine, cold, calculating, and full of hate. It was clear that he wouldn't stop, not until he'd ruined me. I felt a mix of relief and dread. He was back in custody, but for how long? And when he got out, would he come for me again? With him back behind bars, I hoped for peace, but the damage he'd done was deep. I was constantly on edge, flinching at every noise, every shadow. Friends suggested I move, start fresh somewhere new, but that felt like letting him win. Why should I give up my home, my life, because of his obsession? Yet, staying meant living in fear, always looking over my shoulder. I began to question everything. How did it come to this? How could one man hold so much power over my life even after being exposed and arrested? It was a cruel irony. Determined to reclaim my sense of safety, I threw myself into advocacy. I spoke out about the dangers of unchecked power in HOA organizations, warning others about the potential for abuse. I shared my story at community events, helped push for new laws to protect homeowners from harassment, and even worked with investigative reporters to uncover similar cases. If I couldn't erase the past, at least I could prevent it from happening to someone else. It became my mission, giving me a purpose beyond my own survival. Yet, despite my public strength, the fear remained, lurking in the corners of my mind. Then, one evening, as I was locking up, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer. A cold voice spoke on the other end, low and mocking. "You think this is over? It's just beginning." My blood ran cold. It was him. But how? He was supposed to be in custody. I called the police, my heart pounding, but they confirmed my worst fear. He had been released on a technicality, a paperwork error that allowed him to walk free. I hung up, my hands shaking. He was out there again, watching, waiting, and I knew he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. I realized then that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about control. He couldn't stand losing his power, his influence, and he blamed me for his downfall. I was his obsession, the symbol of his defeat, and he wouldn't rest until he destroyed me. But I was done living in fear. If he wanted a fight, then I would give him one. I contacted my lawyer, demanding every legal protection possible. I reached out to the media again, making his release public knowledge, ensuring that everyone knew who he was and what he was capable of. I refused to be his victim. I also took matters into my own hands, hiring private security and fortifying my home. Every window and door was reinforced, and the security system was upgraded to military-grade technology. I even took self-defense classes, determined never to be caught off guard. But the real battle was psychological. I had to confront the fear he'd planted in me, to face it head-on rather than letting it control me. He thrived on intimidation, on making people feel powerless. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Weeks passed with no sign of him. The silence was unnerving, but I refused to let my guard down. Then, one night, I heard footsteps outside my window. My heart raced, but this time, I was ready. The security alarms blared, and the cameras lit up the night like daylight. Caught in the floodlights, he froze, his face twisted in rage and desperation. It was over. The police arrived within minutes, surrounding him before he could escape. As they cuffed him, he looked at me one last time, his eyes burning with hatred. But I saw something else. Defeat. He knew he'd lost, and this time, there was no escaping the consequences. He was sentenced to prison, this time with no chance of parole. The community finally breathed easy, free from his terror. I rebuilt my life, piece by piece, reclaiming my home and my peace of mind. But I knew I'd never be the same. His obsession had scarred me, but it also made me stronger, more resilient. I had faced fear and refused to be broken. In the end, he lost because I chose to fight back, to stand up to his tyranny. Message for viewers and readers: no one should live in fear or be bullied into submission. Stand up for your rights and never let anyone take away your freedom. Sometimes, the greatest strength is found in refusing to back down. If you or someone you know is facing harassment, seek help, speak out, and fight for justice. You are not alone.